Hi, I'm Paul Stringflow, Technical Director here at Gardner Systems, welcoming you to our Enabling Your Journey to the Cloud on-demand event. If you didn't manage to attend the event first time, or you're just coming back to check out the great information that you heard one more time, then enjoy the sessions that we have. This video has been broken into two parts. In part one, Caley of NetApp shares with us his journey to the cloud information. During this session, he'll be sharing with you some of the top tips to ensure that you get the very best from your cloud journey, and make sure you don't get caught out by any of the regular pitfalls that we often see when people try and make that move to the cloud. We have things around cost, we have things around architectural design, and of course, some important information about planning for removing your data from the cloud at some point in the future. We hope you enjoy the session, and if you do have any questions, then do contact the team here at Gardner Systems. Enjoy Grant's presentation one more time.
So I'm Grant Caley, the Chief Technologist for NetApp in the UK and Ireland, and I've been with NetApp for 20 years. So, cloud is something which when I started with NetApp wasn't even an inkling in anybody's eye, to be honest. And NetApp's journey has kind of matched that, I suppose, in the sense that, we've been selling on-premise data storage, data management solutions for the last 30 years. But within the last 5 or 6 years of that, we've really made an effort to start helping customers take that data management into the cloud, because the challenges that customers face are the same in the cloud as they are on premise. It's not anything different. It just happens to be a cloud provider's data center. You still have to do all the things that you would do in your data center when you go to the cloud. And actually the kind of focus of this presentation is actually on that, because I think a lot of people blindly initially assumed that the cloud solved everything for them. They could literally take a service, drop it into the cloud. It would be cost effective, efficient, agile, scalable, paid on a monthly basis, and everything would be rosy. Well, the reality is, I'm sure you're all aware, it's not quite like that. And for a lot of customers, they've had to rethink that strategy. And that's really what I'm going to cover on this presentation, is how we look at some of the challenges, and obviously in context as to how NetApp can help solve some of them. We can't solve all of them, of course. So we are looking at a world where IT's moved from being in the data center, 4 walls, we controlled everything. We had all our comms, security, processes, procedures, everything we needed to do. We may have moved to a model where we decided to outsource some of that. And in some cases, that is the scenario for customers, wherever you happen to be putting your services. But then the cloud came along and we started to look at, firstly, software as a service. It's the easy one to adopt. Office 365 has grown exponentially. In fact, you could almost probably predict that in 5 years' time, there won't be any other email system apart from Office 365. It's been that popular in its uptake. And SaaS services are great because you don't have to manage anything. It's all provided. You just click and use the application. You still have a challenge around your data, though, that sits in there. And that's something which people need to be aware of. But the cloud has really opened up the possibility of creating a data center in somebody else's data center. So you create your own virtual private data center inside Amazon or Azure or Google, and then you can create your own infrastructure as a service. And that still has to be delivered and managed by you. You're consuming somebody else's storage, compute, networking, and other services, but it's still for the customer to kind of manage. For some customers, though, that's not where they want to go to, or they're trying to balance between cloud use and on-premise. And for a lot of customers, they're still looking at building their own clouds in their own data center, so building their own private clouds. And that's absolutely a model we see today. We don't see one or any of these being predominant. It's a combination of all of these. And actually, for those customers that are kind of sitting at the edge, that are maybe building cloud native services or are looking at microservices and containerization or Kubernetes, we are starting to see, and actually, to be honest, in my conversations with customers, I'm seeing more of it this year than I have done in the previous years. I suppose that's inevitable, but I'm actually seeing a lot of customers looking in anger at containerization and how they actually could consider breaking up parts of their operations and containerizing part of it, not necessarily all of it. And that happens not just in the cloud, people looking at the platforms there, but also doing that in their own data center. But the challenge is actually that it's not one of these models that we have to manage from an IT perspective. We probably have to manage data and services that sit across all of these different models. And that's really the challenge. How do you gain full control over an IT landscape that is not just within your data center now, but encompasses services in AWS, in Azure, in Google, and other providers? It's a complex world if you think about it. And when you start to think about how we used to deliver enterprise with a capital E services in the data center, we had everything around about business continuity, disaster recovery, protection, automation if we had that. how do you now do that in all of these new environments as well, and still keep the business running, still keep the business secure and available, and and serving your customers at the end of the day. So it's not easy, but interestingly, when you talk to customers about where they are on the cloud journey, you get different viewpoints, I suppose. If you're lucky enough, and on the left-hand side, you might be cloud native, as in you started to build in the cloud from day one. You may be a startup, and that's the cheapest, easiest way to get up and running, which is absolutely the case, and that's why the cloud is very popular. You might be an existing organization who's decided to break their IT into two parts. We've got what we did in the past, that's our legacy, that will continue in the data center, but everything new we'll build in the cloud. So that's kind of called enterprise greenfield, if you like. And that's very common as well. And then you've got those organizations that kind of, through no choice of the IT department, the users started buying services in the cloud. And we're aware of the term shadow IT, but we do see quite a bit of that as well. So on the left, you've got those kind of cloud native customers who are very much doing stuff in the cloud today to some degree. But then you've got those customers, and this is the biggest bracket, I think, is those that have a cloud first strategy. And I say it's a strategy, it's not necessarily a reality. And for them, it's really around about their CEO, their director, whoever the person is at the top from an IT perspective, has made a strategy decision that the cloud will be their deployment option of choice. Now, how far they are on that journey is a different question. And actually talking to some executives in British companies, why are you going to the cloud? Actually, the funny thing is, the reason they're going to the cloud is because everybody else is. I thought, that's not really a good strategy necessarily. Have you really thought about this? But you'd be surprised at how many people that is the answer. But actually, a lot of companies realize that the cloud is going to transform their business. The things it brings to an IT from an agility perspective and an ability to roll out new services quickly is something they want to adopt, but probably in combination with their existing data centers. So we do get a lot of people who talk around about how can we adopt the cloud, but in order to do that, we need to also consider how we modernize what we're doing in our data center to make it either cloud connected or cloud ready if it's going to be transformed and moved into the cloud. So there's that as well. And actually, a lot of customers are just really grappling with how they also modernize their legacy. They've got a lot of complexity sitting in their data centers. They quite often see the cloud as the way of solving that challenge of complexity. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily always the right answer, but it's certainly one which some people see. And then there's another two categories of cloud users, I suppose, from a customer perspective. Those that are cloud what? As in, I ask them, are you on the journey to the cloud? And they go, yes. And they go, well, actually, no, but we're thinking about it. Those are the kind of cloud what? They're at the beginning of the journey. And actually, they're probably in a better place than most other people because the technologies that they might look towards have matured significantly. And that's a lot of traditional IT sits in that bucket. They're really starting on this journey to think about how they could adopt some cloud services. It's maybe just an aspiration, and quite often they haven't made the move yet because, let's face it, going to the cloud requires a whole new set of skills which you have to train up for. You have to have staff. You have, maybe you go to a partner like Gardner Systems or somebody else, but there's a lack of knowledge which can slow down that journey. And then actually, if you were unfortunate in some cases to be those that got to the cloud first, a lot of those are looking at not fully coming out of the cloud, but realizing that the cloud doesn't deliver for everything they were looking to do. They've got, suddenly realized that the services they built in the cloud initially have proven very expensive. They've lost a bit of control over them. There's governance reasons as to why they maybe can't stay in the cloud, maybe GDPR sovereignty or some other reason. Or they're actually looking at building proper hybrid services that encompass both the cloud and on-premise. So those are almost the kind of cloud exit customers. They're looking at what they do in the cloud, but how they can bridge that back to the data center. The reality is we're all somewhere on this spectrum. There isn't a right or wrong answer as to where you are. It really depends on your business, the capabilities within your business, the desire, I suppose, to use the cloud. Quite interesting, actually, when you think about it. As to where
Can I just ask a question, actually, Grant, then, but based on that, do you see a certain type of company who might be in one of those kind of positions? So is there a certain type of company who might be cloud first or might be cloud exit? Is there some kind of commonality in them, or can it genuinely be, any company based on, a whole matter of things?
So I took out a few slides actually on this, but there's the concept of digital transformation, which everybody's probably heard of. But what does that really mean? And what it means is that companies are realizing they need to be much more disruptive in their own markets before they're disrupted themselves by other companies. And I think those that realize that's the case are the ones that are most likely to move to the cloud first. Because in order to digitally transform your business, you need to do it quickly. You can't afford to wait for 18 months, 24 months for a process, for a capability to appear and enable. You need to be able to do it today or tomorrow to capture some business moment that's come along. So I don't think there's a particular industry that we see this in. I mean, I've talked to transportation companies that deliver all the parcels that are piling up outside my front door on a daily basis. And some of those have gone way ahead of what you'd expect. They're doing cloud services, they're building Kubernetes and containerization platforms, and that's not what you'd expect for just that type of company. And then I've come across other companies, massive multinationals who are way behind the curve in terms of their strategy. So I don't think there's one answer, to be honest. It really depends a lot on who you've got running your company from an IT perspective and their kind of vision as to where they see that going. That makes a big difference. And then also this digital transformation, those companies that are trying to do, for example, if you need to produce a mobile app because that's the way to engage with your customers, the way to do that nowadays is to do it in the cloud. Absolutely quickly develop it in the cloud, maybe then pull it back on premise. But it's that almost that desire drives a lot of the kind of initiative, but it's across all companies. There's no one answer, I'm afraid. So
that's great. Thanks, Grant.
That's okay. So the interesting thing is that, and these are a lot of challenges. Most people blithely moved into the cloud initially without really considering the challenges that they would face. If they'd been thinking about the cloud deployment they were about to build as a typical IT project, they would have had proper project managers, they'd have had cost analysis, they'd have had risk analysis, they would have done proper functional specifications, they would have done all of this stuff. You'd be really surprised at how many people don't do any of that when they move to the cloud, because they just assume that the cloud provides that already, and it doesn't. It's still just an IT data center running somewhere else. You still have to go through all the exercises that you would normally do when you're considering building or deploying something new for the first time. And the challenges fall into these categories. The first one is around about cost. Data in the cloud is expensive. And data that stays in the cloud becomes even more expensive because it matures, it grows, it accumulates. And managing that data lifecycle and how you deploy data, how you maybe make that data accessible when you suddenly need to host users. You start off with 500 customers coming in, then you've got 1,000. My greatest example of that is my kids play Fortnite. They grew from expecting, I think it was about 1 million or 2 million users, 250 million users they have playing that game now. So you can imagine the poor IT guy at the bottom thinking, oh my God, how do I scale to deliver that? That's what the cloud can offer, but you have to think about the challenges of doing that within the framework of what it provides. So it's a real problem. Also, the other challenge is, how do you get your data to the cloud? How do you get it there effectively? How do you get it back? How do you move it across clouds? Because there's a cost to do that, and there's an effort and a complexity. And actually the biggest one, I think, is around about service levels. In the data center, we plan for 4 nines, 5 nines, 6 nines of availability. We've got business continuity, disaster recovery processes. We can get our business back up and running in hours, maybe, if we have a big outage, whatever that happens to be. In the cloud, you have to design that. You have to provide that. The SLAs that come with each of the individual cloud services are not actually that good if you consider them. And when you aggregate them all together, you're likely to be building a service which isn't as reliable as a service you'd build in your data center. So you really have to look at whether that matches what you're trying to do. And that means looking at the performance options, high availability, business continuity, DR, the options around cloud failure, how you manage across that. It's a lot of challenges when you think about it. And a lot of people just kind of assume that it's given in the cloud, but it's not. And then if you're really at the advanced edge, how do you look at making what you're doing multi-cloud? Can you build these services to be portable between Azure and Google and AWS? Because ultimately, price will become a factor, services and features will become a factor, and you maybe also want to spread your bets rather than have one company. So there's a lot of things you have to think about there as well. And that's before we go into the challenge around about security and compliance. In the data center, we've got it locked down. We know what we're doing. We encrypt, we do this, X, Y, and Z. We meet all these procedures and we document them and everything else. In the cloud, you have to also consider how you do things like encryption and how do you detect anomalous use of the data you're putting there? How do you do compliance monitoring? It's not easy when you get into these types of environments to do that. And then actually automation is, and integrating what you do is important as well. I don't think anybody should be building a cloud service that isn't fully automated now. You know, the way we used to do IT was we built it out of Lego blocks, and then we ran it individually. You can't do that now. You need to be able to automate across these, if nothing else, just to remove errors and emissions and standardize as you go. So that has to be built in from day one. And there are tools to do that, but you have to make a strategy and a decision to help you on that. And then also, how do you deal with what's in the data center, what's staying behind? You know, how do you modernize that environment? And importantly, how do you get it connected to the cloud so that the data can flow, and maybe even the services, as they become cloud ready, can flow between that as well. So there's a huge number of challenges in that respect as to what people are trying to do. So NetApp really look at helping solve some of these for customers. The biggest challenge we find for customers going into the cloud is cost. Believe it or not, that is the biggest one. As I mentioned, data matures. You end up, you know, you put data in, you pay for it monthly, you pay to move the data between areas in the cloud and in and out, you pay for the copies of data, you pay to add on business continuity, DR, you've got backup to consider in the cloud, and you've got all that junk that you forget to delete. Well, that junk becomes really expensive when it's sitting on cloud resources. And we worked with two companies who had this challenge. One was Clavis Insight, who are an Irish retail analytics company. They started off with very little data in the cloud, so their business model worked really well. As they got successful, the data in the cloud grew significantly, to the point of fact the cloud storage bill became the biggest part of their cloud bill, full stop. So they had a real challenge in that respect. And another company who published the Daily Express and about 250 regional newspapers, called Reach, they actually had a different challenge. They were looking to move to the cloud, to move production and DR to the cloud, but the cost in the cloud was going to make that prohibitive. So they also had a challenge around about how they could drive services to the cloud, but keep the costs under control. So what we did for these two companies, because NetApp has the capability to deploy, you're probably all well familiar with our platforms in the data center, our NAS and SAN solutions, and all the data management they come built in with. And one of the key features of those on-premise platforms is storage efficiency. You know, deduplication, thin provisioning, all those technologies, compression, they all reduce the physical cost in the data center. We can take that same technology and deploy it in as a software storage solution effectively into AWS, Azure, and Google. And that technology helped both Clavis Insight and Reach reduce their cloud storage bills by over 60%. So it was cheaper to go into the cloud with NetApp than it was to go into the cloud without NetApp. And it managed to help them significantly reduce, you know, the cost of their cloud bills as they did that. And it was all through bringing storage efficiency technologies, compression, deduplication. It was about being able to transparently tier between primary cloud storage and S3 cloud storage and create a, you know, a transparent tier across that. And then also, if you're taking copies of data, if you're trying to move the data, we compress, we dedupe, we do zero space cloning technologies. All of these things, when you add them up together, reduce the cost of that cloud journey significantly, to the point of fact that it makes it, you know, very almost cost effective to go into the cloud when you leverage these technologies that NetApp can provide as well. So we really have talked, you know, we really have brought a range of technologies to help customers think about the cost challenge of going to the cloud, because that's the number one thing that will slow most companies down in that journey.
Just out of interest, Grant, is that still a big thing that you see? Because I thought what's been interesting over those last couple of slides that you've talked about was, one, when you gave the example of Fortnite, what that for me is a great example of where cloud has its value. You know, it's that ability to scale rapidly is something that's very difficult to do traditionally on premises, you know, because you're buying new servers, plugging them in, buying more storage. That's a difficult thing to do in a data center. So cloud's really good at that. But interestingly, on these examples that you've given, of course, that's a great example of what cloud isn't good at. You know, cloud isn't good necessarily at delivering a lot of the enterprise, in this case, storage efficiencies that many organizations are used to. So when we think we've got 10 terabytes of data on our storage efficient platforms within the data center, when we move it to cloud and suddenly find 40 terabytes of data, it becomes a real shock cost wise. So is that still a real challenge that people are seeing? Because obviously we've talked about cost from the start with cloud for a lot of people, but are people still getting caught out?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, most companies tend to get caught out because initially in the cloud, you don't have that much data probably. So the compute services you've got, you know what they cost, they run. It's only after 6 months, a year that you realize that these costs are going to increase significantly. And the cost, again, you're right, the cloud is great for being agile. You can spin up thousands of new services, but you pay for that agility. And most people understand that, and that's why they use it, because they can flex down as well as up. But the data stays in the cloud. it has gravity, it has weight. And that's the thing you need to address, because although the services can be spun up and spun down, the data won't. It will stay as a kind of a lump in the cloud, which has to be paid for. So yeah, that's really important. And actually the other, I suppose, thing is that, you've really got to plan this, because if you have 100 terabytes in your data center, for example, as a nice round example, or 10 terabytes, whatever it happens to be, if you move that to the cloud, you probably have to inflate that data. It's probably already sitting on a cost-efficient, storage-efficient platform, whether it's NetApp or somebody else. So you have to inflate that data to put it into the cloud. So suddenly that 10 terabytes in your data center of tin becomes 20 terabytes of storage in the cloud. So it's really important that you consider technologies that you can bring to help you reduce that in the data center as you do in the cloud as well.
Well, one of my favourite phrases that a couple of friends of mine in the industry like to use is that cloud isn't a charity. So I think it's always a thing worth remembering.
Yeah, there's a good reason that Jeff Bezos is one of the richest men in the world, and actually it's mostly based on AWS revenue, not on Amazon shopping revenue, to be honest. So yeah, it's interesting. The other challenge is, how do you get to the cloud? Because if you think about it, whichever cloud you choose, AWS, Azure, Google, they've all got different technologies, different platforms. Your data is sitting in the data center in unstructured format, structured systems. It might be sitting in object format. How do you move your data into these new environments? So firstly, you've got to consider, how do you migrate your data to the cloud? Then you might need to build availability services between clouds, if that's your strategy. Maybe you want to pull data back out of the cloud. And the challenge with these capabilities is that every time you move data in or out of the cloud, you potentially open yourselves to ingress and egress costs, which are actually quite substantial if you're not careful in terms of data mobility. And the other challenge is, you might be moving all your shared data into the cloud, for example. Well, are you going to store it in a NAS share in the cloud, or are you going to put it into an object repository? How do you do protocol conversion? So there's a lot of different sets of challenges that customers face in that respect. And NetApp's solution to this is really, we talk about having a data fabric. The thing that NetApp's data fabric brings is, it brings a commonality of data mobility capability between platforms. Those platforms can be in the data center, but they can also be in any one of the public clouds. And that replication technology that sits underneath that is very efficient, because it dedupes, compresses, and encrypts the data before it then moves it to the new location. So for migration to cloud, it makes it a lot quicker, because you're moving less data. And if you're moving it onto a platform that doesn't have to rehydrate it because of that, storage efficiency that we talked about, then that makes a big difference as well. You have to consider how you do DR to that, and that technology enables that. But then if you're doing cloud to cloud, if you want to build services in the cloud that have zero RPO, for example, in the data center, that's easy enough to do, well, relatively easy. How do you do that in the cloud? Well, these technologies that I'm talking about here from NetApp support and enable these types of scenarios. How do you go from cloud to data center if you want to pull your data back? When you move that data, if you're moving full fat data, you'll pay full fat prices, I suppose is the best way to describe it, in ingress and egress charges. So the technology that NetApp bring to that really help customers reduce the data before transferring it, which makes a big difference. And because it's ubiquitous across all our on-premise platforms, our software-defined solutions, our cloud platforms, you've got a common way of moving data that makes this really simple. And then with partner companies like Data Dynamics and others that we work with, we're also able to do a lot of the remapping of the data as you move it. So if I move data from on-premise, I maybe need to repermission it. How do I do that and change the permissions and the shares to reflect the new cloud environment? And also, how do I convert from file to object, for example, or object to file? Well, we've got tools and capabilities that will enable that for customers to be able to do that as well. Because data mobility is, one of the big challenges as you look at a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud type of scenario.
I'd just like to ask, Grant, actually, a real good question in the chat from Lee, talking about, is there a point where using something like NetApp storage efficiencies inside of public cloud, is there a point where that starts to pay off? So, what is a kind of a break point where it remains, maybe more cost efficient just to use native cloud, or where there becomes real value in adding kind of NetApp technology on top?
Yeah, so we do two types of service in the cloud. One is a managed service, which is run by the hyperscaler through their portals, etc. That platform is cheaper than using cloud file services anyway. So it makes it cheaper to use it. So that's one platform. The other platform, which brings all the storage efficiencies for customers, is Cloud Volumes ONTAP. And probably, and I'm kind of roughly guessing, I think the breakpoint there is going to be, it depends. So the initial breakpoint is probably around about maybe 5 to 10 terabytes. But if as soon as you take one snapshot of that or take one copy of that, the breakpoint drops in half and half again and half again. So depending on how you want to use your data, if you want to take a backup of it, a replication copy of it, a copy for test and dev or cloning or patching or whatever, it becomes cost effective almost immediately in terms of using the technology there. If you were just putting raw data in and not leveraging any of the kind of copy management or data management, then I would kind of estimate you're probably sitting in the region of about 5-10 terabytes worth of data before you start to see some improvements. Depends on the data type as well. If you drop in very textual data, you'll probably get almost 80% compression advantages, for example. So there's not an easy answer, unfortunately. It depends on the data type. It depends on your use of data in the cloud. But the likelihood is that it will be cost effective, almost immediately, depending on what you're doing.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like it. Even in 5 to 10 terabytes in most enterprises now is kind of almost your starting point for data. There's not lots of enterprises. Certainly, I don't think there's anybody on this call today who has less data than that they would be working in. So certainly an opportunity for people to look at that if they're considering putting data in public cloud, that NetApp could play a part relatively early on.
Yeah, and some of the transparent tiering technology to S3 can actually accelerate that, because if you drop the data in the cloud, typically 20% of it's hot, or less. The remaining 80%, you can turn up the dial and have it transparently tiered into an S3 repository. That changes the scenario quite effectively as well. So the other thing I mentioned before was about building service levels in the cloud. In the data center, we're used to high availability, disaster recovery, business continuity, tuning performance, operational consistency, standardization, and automation if we've reached that point. The challenge in the cloud is that these services either aren't available or are very fragmented in how they're available, and they're certainly not available consistently across multiple clouds. So every time you deploy in a different cloud, you'd have to consider a different strategy around about building service levels. NetApp provide the ability to effectively deploy a data management platform that is the same as you deploy in your data center. So, we can deploy SAN and NAS solutions in the data center. They deliver, snapshots, business continuity, replication for DR. They've got security. They've got all the storage efficiencies. They've got different performance tiers and quality of service that you can apply. We can do all of that in the cloud as well on the platforms that NetApp deploy in AWS, Azure, and Google. And the great thing about those platforms is you can just literally go to the cloud and say, I want 5 terabytes of NetApp, click, and it will be deployed for you. And then you can then build these capabilities or just tick box these capabilities on top of that data set that you put in there. So we can do replication between synchronous replication between availability zones if you want zero data loss. We can do DR replication between regions, clouds, or even multiple clouds if that's what you're looking for, or back to the data center. We can integrate business continuity snapshots, and the great thing about the snapshots from NetApp is they're instant to take, instant to recover, whereas the ones in the cloud, although they're instant to take and appear instant to recover, you're actually repatriating from an S3 backstore, which is being used to back those snapshots. So you don't get the RPO of 0, which you would for an application, which you can with the NetApp technology. And then performance in the cloud. If you need high performance in the cloud, you've got to remember the cloud's a shared storage platform. Well, NetApp actually offers a service in the cloud called Cloud Volume Service that's built on dedicated flash hardware with quality of service to give you a performance level that you can select per terabyte of data that you put in, depending on what your application needs. And we're seeing actually more customers move things like Oracle and other big enterprise apps into that platform because of the guarantees they can get around about performance. And then ultimately, if you're going to build a data center, and you don't really want to be building a world where the technology in the data center is different from the technology in the cloud, because that creates inconsistencies and errors. We enable the ability to standardize the data management across all those environments, and then to automate that through APIs. So there's a lot of advantage to NetApp. And actually in the cloud, it's not a big deployment to consider using NetApp. As I mentioned, you can literally go there, and for a month you could say, and actually there's a free trial for most of these technologies anyway. You can say, I want to have a couple of terabytes of NetApp, have it for a month, do some stuff, throw it away, and you can do all of that. That is one advantage that the cloud brings to that, in that respect. But people really need to consider how they are multi-cloud going forwards, and this is not necessarily something which a lot of people will run into from day one, but you will from day 25, for example. or 365. How do you build a consistent platform that enables you to deploy data in infrastructure as a service in the cloud? Maybe you're deploying data into VMware cloud on top of it at AWS, Azure, Google, or your own data center. Maybe you're looking at containerization or some other form of platform as a service. The challenge across all of these is you're going to have different processes, procedures, capabilities as regards how you manage your data. And that's really what NetApp solves in terms of helping customers. We really bring, oops, I think I must have taken a slide out there. There we go. We really bring a consistent set of data platforms that you can deploy across all of these environments, whether it's a software-defined one in AWS, a physical platform in your data center, a small platform on top of your VMware service at your remote office. We have a consistent set of data management endpoints, as we call them, that enables to deliver a consistent set of data management capabilities across all of these. So we can bring storage efficiencies to not just the data center, but to your VMware environment, to your cloud environment, to your whichever environment. And we bring these capabilities into microservices and also into platform as a service in terms of where customers might want to put their data as well. So security and compliance.
Just out of interest, actually, Grant, so you know, kind of listening to those last couple of slides, I mean, one of the things that comes through very strongly there is the importance of design and the importance of thinking about this. You know, you're still finding one of the issues that you may come across is that organizations make the leap into public cloud, that it's almost this idea, you know, we've spoken before about the idea that people take their 25 years of experience they've had in a data center and all the good practice they've developed, go into the crowd, so go into the cloud and kind of forget it all. You know, is that a real problem, and can that have huge impacts on the success of a cloud migration long term?
Yeah, I think so, and that's where partners, you know, such as yourselves, are really important, because it's a new world, you know, for a lot of people, and the misassumption is that you can just click it as a service, deploy it, and everything else is done for you around that. Well, that's not the case. You know, you're actually opening up bigger. I mean, the cloud is arguably the most secure environment that you could possibly deploy into, because Google, AWS, and Microsoft spend millions and billions on cloud security. But it's cloud security to protect them being breached. It's not cloud security to protect you against you making mistakes. And it's that lack of knowledge which will be the stumbling block in the cloud. So it's really important that you do the same due diligence that you would for a brand new on-premise service as you would for a brand new cloud service, you know, including consulting with partners and vendors who have done that before and trying to get that knowledge together. So yeah, it's a good point. Security, as I mentioned, is really important, you know, keeping all the things and doing what you need to do in order to secure your data in the cloud. And then that bring a whole range of services, actually some of which are free, for example. So when you deploy data in NetApp, in the cloud on NetApp, we bring free compliance detection, so the ability to monitor the content of data that appears there and tell you if it's breaking policies or regulations or whatever it happens to be. But we also layer on things like encryption and key management in or out of the cloud, the ability to build additional services to do anomaly detection on data, so to detect ransomware attacks and that type of misappropriated use of data, if you like, even when it has secure access. And then actually just being able to bring the traditional things around about proper segmentation of roles and responsibilities and proper segmentation of data to the different use cases that you're putting into the cloud. We layer all that across the platforms that we can deploy, not just in the data center, but into those cloud environments as well. I was going to talk very briefly just about something that's coming up, because moving into the cloud for most customers is actually a fairly traditional journey. In the first part, it's around about building infrastructure as a service, which is almost just replacing servers, network, and storage, but now doing it in AWS or Azure. Other customers are looking at consuming some of the services that are there. And those that are really thinking about the next step are really looking at all the applications they use and how they break those into microservices or containers and deploying those in the cloud. And the reason for doing that is that matches the cloud's scalability model. If you can scale that Fortnite example, the services which provide for 1 million users, if you need to scale those to 250 million, that is a containerized environment. You cannot do that with traditional infrastructure. It's just impossible to do. So going forwards, actually an interesting thing, and I think I mentioned it to you, Paul, was that VMware, who are really the biggest virtualization provider that we know today, they spent their only acquisitions for the last 12 months, and they spent 8 billion on this, were all Kubernetes companies. VMware see the world of virtualization becoming a Kubernetes world in the next 3 to 5 years, and they're making the investments today to do that. Now, I'm not saying we're there yet, obviously, because we're not, but it will be the future of data, kind of service hosting, I suppose, and service almost virtualization, but also new applications and how they're built. And the big challenge with Kubernetes is that it's currently a stateless world. You deploy a Kubernetes cluster or an application or a container, and then when it's finished, you turn it off and the data gets thrown away. That's great for scalable applications like web front ends, portals, that type of stuff, but it's not good for databases, persistent data. So the next element that NetApp is investing in, and it's a project at the moment, but it should be available hopefully towards the end of the year, is around about how can we build data management, so all those things I just talked about, into Kubernetes, but build it natively into Kubernetes. Not something that sits outside, but something actually that sits inside the Kubernetes cluster. And initially what it will do is it will enable, it will go out and discover all the applications and clusters and containers and all their data that sit within that Kubernetes stack, even when they're sitting in on-premise data centers or cloud data centers. And then it will enable you to back up, to recover, and to migrate those services with the data across multiple locations. And that's really important because Kubernetes doesn't provide these mechanisms built in. And if you want to move data and services portably between on-premise and different clouds, you have to go through a whole painful exercise. And what we're building is the capabilities of data management to flow with the container, so that it can be dragged and dropped. Literally, you could drag your application from your data center and drop it into Google on their container platform. All the data would flow with it, all the data protection, the data management would go with it. And that's really what Project Astra is about. It's that next step of how do we deliver containerized data services across any cloud, across any virtualization platform, but with that data management built in. And it's that layer that will sit across your on-premise data center, your AWS stack, your Microsoft stack, your Google stack, which is the NetApp Data Fabric, to really build the data management into that containerized platform. So I've started redoing my Kubernetes training this year because I think I realized that in 2 years' time, I'll need to be an expert on those technologies. But just very quickly to close, NetApp has been about a lot of customers delivering solutions either in the data center, SAN and NAS, private cloud solutions for HCI and for the FlexPod conversion infrastructure stacks, or delivering solutions at the remote edge of their network. But really what we talked about today is how do we extrapolate that value into the public clouds to give you platforms that you can still host your data on and bring all the benefits. And it's really about bringing consistent data management, business continuity, DR, performance, efficiencies, but then layering on monitoring and optimization, security and compliance, the ability to build a global file namespace, and Jaap is going to talk about that next actually, across all of these locations to enable access across all these locations, but with your data held in the cloud. And then the ability to layer on things like remote desktops, remote VDI deployments across any location and the likes, and obviously microservices, as I talked about. So I've talked about a lot. Hopefully it was a little bit useful. Hopefully it made you think a little bit about the cloud journey and some of the challenges, but certainly that's what Paul and Gardner systems are here to help you with, along with what we can do as well.
Well, that's great, Grant. I've got a real cool question actually from Martin here, talking about using NetApp technology as a cloud backup solution. So I'll read his question actually. So can NetApp technology be used as a complete cloud backup solution, long-term snapshots, etc., or would additional software be required and NetApp best used as a target? And supplementary to that, is it possible to pull individual items out of NetApp snapshots for things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, mailboxes, that kind of thing?
Yeah, quite a lot of questions there. So firstly, yes, we can be a DR target in the cloud and then bring all the storage efficiencies, tiering to S3, etc. If you're a NetApp customer on premise, you can effectively replicate your snapshot, SnapVault, SnapMirror to the cloud and then maintain that copy in the cloud. From those copies, if you were backed up from NetApp using the snapshot technologies to the cloud, you can recover any item that you stored. It's held in the format that it was stored in. So a file appears as a spreadsheet, appears as a spreadsheet, a LUN appears as a LUN, a mailbox, Exchange mailbox appears as Exchange mailbox. And we actually have tools through our product called Snap Center that enables you to drill into some of those and to kind of offer capabilities to do things like mailbox restores and other things. Where we take it a step differently is we also offer the ability to connect to your SaaS Office 365 services. So if you've got SharePoint, OneDrive, email in the cloud, we can back those up as well for you and give a granular level of recovery on that. So the answer generally to those questions is yes, but it's probably a bit hard to go into the architecture with all the kind of spinning parts that consists of.
I know for Martin, it's a very relevant question right now. He probably after this call is going to be talking about exactly that, I guess. Yeah. Richard also asks, are there cost calculators to review how much different types of data on premises would cost in the cloud, such as snapshots, backup, archive data?
Yeah, and that's actually a good segue to what I forgot to mention is go to cloud.
Well done, Richard.
Yeah, well done, Richard. Go to cloud.netapp.com. From there, you can choose the calculators which you want. So basically for Cloud Volume Service and Cloud Volumes ONTAP, there are calculators for AWS, Azure, and Google, where you put in how much storage you've got, and it will tell you the comparative cost of natively without NetApp and with NetApp in the cloud. And you can start to look at things like, well, if I get 30% storage efficiency on premise, what would that mean in the cloud? If I keep 2 snapshots a day, what does that mean? If I, all those options you can check, and you will see the cost comparison based on the current cloud costs in almost like real time in terms of doing that. So yeah, those calculators are there.
In addition to that, actually, Richard runs NetApp on premises currently. Is there any additional stuff that we can find out because he already uses ONTAP?
So actually, the interesting thing is, if you have ONTAP already, you know all the things it can do. It can do all those things in the cloud. There's a few exceptions sitting down at the kind of RAID level stuff, obviously. But for the majority, I'd say 95% of what you do with ONTAP, we can do in the cloud as well. And that's the real advantage of NetApp, is it's not a different operating system. What we deploy in the data center, we can deploy into AWS, Azure, and Google. And actually, it can almost, depending on which service you use, Cloud Volumes ONTAP looks like a virtual storage controller. It's managed through a Unified Manager, System Manager, the same tools you use in the data center. They'll just appear as controllers that have appeared in the cloud, but managed through the same environment. So if you're in that position, you're in a fortunate world that you can actually just extrapolate the on-premise value straight into the cloud as well.
Well, and before we hand over to Jaap then, Grant, so obviously, so people on this session, on this call today, who maybe are in different parts of that kind of journey to cloud, is there any kind of, if you've got a couple of top tips that you would give them, to perhaps if they're just getting started, things that they should become, couple of things that Grant do to try and to ensure that journey to use of public cloud is a successful one?
Yeah, I think just take the run book or the procedure guide that you have for what you deploy on premise and all the checklists that you'll go through, and just make sure you can do those in the cloud. But the thing which will become the biggest factor is looking at the is building a proper spreadsheet of what the cost will look like from day one, and extrapolating the growth of data and services as it goes forwards. And it's that cost which will probably make you realize that a lot of what we talked about today is really pertinent to moving to the cloud. So I think if you do that traditional analysis of business continuity, disaster recovery, risk, all of that stuff, but also do a proper cost analysis of what that will likely cost as you go forwards, then you're in a good place to do that. And that's where, I think a lot of what NetApp does becomes really relevant to help on that journey.
Yeah, and I think when we first talked about doing this event, one of the things that you said to me that really stuck with me was that idea of, as you move to public cloud, don't throw away 20 years of good practice you've had in data center. Yeah. I think that's a great tip. So thank you, Grant, and obviously Grant.
I hope you found that useful. Grant shared some great information there, and if you do have any questions, then please don't hesitate to ask the team here at Gardner Systems. Now, don't forget part 2 of our video, where we take a practical look at how we can use cloud to both solve traditional data center problems, as well as give us a bridge for moving our on-premises data center information into the public cloud as we take a look at NetApp's global file cache. Enjoy part 2.